Hello class, this is just a brief introduction to the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which is the next book we're going to be reading for class. First, something about Frederick Douglass himself. He was born a slave in Maryland in 1818, and the narrative that we're reading is basically his autobiography from that time, when he was from his birth, until his escape from slavery in 1838. And he went north and changed his name. Frederick Douglass was not his birth name. He changed his name to Frederick Douglass and lived first as a kind of a manual laborer for a while, but pretty early on his talents as a speaker and writer were discovered, and he became very active in the anti-slavery movement. He published this narrative that we're reading in 1845, and you'll notice that the subtitle to this is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. So he wants to emphasize that he personally wrote it. He was active in the anti-slavery movement all the way up until the emancipation of the slaves during the Civil War. During the Civil War, he was very active in recruiting black soldiers for the Union side, including his own sons, who fought in the Union Army. He even advised Abraham Lincoln on a couple of occasions. And after the Civil War, he continued to work for the civil rights for blacks, and he worked in the women's suffrage movement. And he had a distinguished political and literary career. He went on to write 2 more autobiographies of different parts of his life. He had several political appointments, including the ambassador to Haiti. And basically, during his whole lifetime, until he died, which was I think in 1895, he was the most famous and distinguished black person in America. And this picture of him, by the way, was taken about in the early 1850s. So this would be 6 or 7 years after he published his autobiography, and something like 15 years after he escaped from slavery. So the autobiography itself, the narrative that we're reading, is different from what we've read so far in this class. First of all, in the fact that it is fact. It's an autobiography. It's a story of what really happened to him. So that is obviously different from everything we've been doing so far, because everything so far has been totally made up. And in fact, writing his autobiography was something of a defense against accusations that he wasn't really who he said he was, because people looked at this guy who was good-looking, well-spoken, clearly highly educated, an amazingly persuasive speaker, and they were like, there's no way this guy was born and raised a slave. And so he wrote it all out. He wrote out his real birth name, which was Frederick Bailey, the name of his mother, the name of all of his owners in succession, exactly where they lived, the locations of their farms, the names of their neighbors. Everything was laid out in this autobiography, and by the way, it has since been verified by historians as well that this is all, in fact, the literal truth. And you might think, wouldn't that be dangerous for an escaped slave to name his master and to say, here I am, I'm right here? In fact, it was dangerous. So immediately after the publication of this autobiography, he left America for 2 years and went on a speaking tour of Great Britain and Ireland. And they were so impressed by him over there that they actually raised enough money to buy him out of slavery. So when he returned to America 2 years later, he was officially a free man. Now, this particular autobiography is one of kind of a subcategory of autobiographies known as slave narratives. There were quite a few of them around at the time. In essence, they're stories told by slaves of what it was like to be a slave. And this one is by far the most famous and probably the best example of this particular genre, but there are others. One of them, 12 Years a Slave, was made into a movie last year. And what's unusual about that one is that's somebody who wasn't born a slave, who was born free, but was kidnapped into slavery. There are some by women about what it was like to be a female slave. And usually they followed a pretty predetermined arc. They told what it was like to be a slave. They had some stories of things that happen to themselves, things that happen to their acquaintances, and they usually end with their escape, for obvious reasons, because you can't write one of these things while you're still a slave. So that's the context in which Frederick Douglass is writing this, and that's kind of what you should know before you start reading it. Now, it's not long. It's not meant to be long. So we're going to finish it in just 2 weeks. Make sure you go ahead and look through it and have questions to bring in next week. It is available for free on the internet, but if you don't have a paper copy, make sure you take notes about specific passages, specific questions you have, so that you can participate fully in class. And I'll see you then.